money, but I made her pay. And looking back, I should have seen the warning signs the moment Aunt Valerie insisted on hosting my 17th birthday at her house, considering she had never shown the slightest interest in celebrating with me before, nor had she ever gone out of her way to be involved in anything related to my life. She had always been the type to keep her distance, offering polite but uninterested miles. At family gatherings, showing up late and leaving early, never bothering to ask me how school was going or what my plans for the future were suddenly out of nowhere. She became the most enthusiastic person in the room when my mother mentioned my upcoming birthday, offering to organize the entire event, going on and on about how important it was to celebrate milestones together as a family, insisting that her home would be the perfect venue for such a special occasion. My parents, always eager to see the best in people even when they didn't deserve it, were quick to accept her offer, brushing off my skepticism as unnecessary paranoia, telling me I should be grateful that she was making such an effort. The party itself started off well enough, with friends and relatives gathered around, cheerful conversations filling the air and the scent of homemade food spreading through the house, making everything feel warm and familiar in a way that almost convinced against me I had been wronged to be suspicious of her sudden generosity. The decorations were almost too elaborate, the kind of detail-oriented setup you'd expect at a wedding, rather than a birthday, as if she were trying to prove something to everyone present, making it impossible to ignore how much time and effort she had poured into orchestrating the event. Every time I received a present, she hovered nearby, insisting on taking a photo of me holding the gift, making sure to document who gave me what, acting like she was simply keeping track for thank you notes, though. Something about the way she went about it felt strangely meticulous, almost clinical, as if she were gathering evidence rather than memories. As the evening went on, I started noticing small moments that seemed off, little details that didn't sit right with me, like how she kept disappearing upstairs for brief periods, returning with a strained expression, barely touching the food she had spent hours preparing. Her demeanor shifting from forced cheerfulness to barely concealed agitation. My cousin Melissa, one of the few people in the family who actually paid attention to things, instead of blindly accepting whatever narrative was presented, caught my eye across the table, silently asking if I had noticed how strange Aunt Valerie was acting, confirming that I wasn't imagining the unsettling atmosphere that had started to creep into what was supposed to be a carefree night. Everything fell apart when she suddenly burst into the living room, her face red, her hands trembling, her voice shaking with just the right amount of theatrical distress to ensure that everyone in the room would take her seriously. The moment she spoke, announcing that her diamond bracelet and an expensive emerald necklace had gone missing from her jewelry box, the entire room went still. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, all eyes turning toward her as she dramatically described how these pieces weren't just valuable, but sentimental heirlooms passed down through generations, irreplaceable treasures that she couldn't bear to lose. Even before she said my name, I knew exactly where this was going, because the way she stared at me, the way she let the silence stretch just long enough to build tension before making her accusation, told me that she had planned this moment carefully, that this wasn't a spontaneous reaction, but something she had been waiting for the perfect moment to execute. She claimed she had seen me sneaking upstairs earlier in the evening, acting suspiciously, suggesting that I had taken advantage of her hospitality to steal from her, making it sound like she had caught me in the ACT, rather than simply assuming the worst without evidence. When I tried to argue that I had never even left the main floor, that I had spent the entire evening surrounded by people, she pulled out what she called proof, a photo on her phone showing my reflection in a hallway mirror upstairs. It took me a moment to process what I was looking at. The blurred but unmistakable image of me in the background of a shot she had taken, making it look like I had been wandering the second floor during the party, when in reality, I immediately recognized the moment it had been taken the day before, when I had come over early to help set up decorations. But the problem with situations like these is that once the accusation is made, once doubt is planted in people's minds, it doesn't matter how ridiculous or easily disprovable the claim might be, because the damage is already done, and the burden of proving innocence becomes an impossible weight to carry. My parents, who had always been my strongest advocates, who had raised me with the belief that they would stand by me no matter what, suddenly weren't looking at me with the unwavering certainty I had always depended on my mother, usually the first To defend me had a flicker of doubt in her eyes, the kind of hesitation that made my stomach twist, because it meant she was considering even for a second that I might actually be capable of doing what Aunt Valerie was accusing me of my father. His expression, unreadable, simply asked me to tell the truth. His voice carrying that quiet disappointment that was somehow worse than anger, making me feel like no matter what I said, it wouldn't be enough to erase the doubt that had already settled. In his mind, they emptied my pockets, checked my backpack, even went through the gifts I had received. But when they found nothing, instead of admitting that they had been wrong to suspect me, Aunt Valerie doubled down, suggesting that I must have hidden the jewelry somewhere, intending to retrieve it later. That's when she took things even further, insisting that she wouldn't feel comfortable unless every single present I had received was returned, just in case I had planned to sell them. After failing to steal the jewelry one by one, my relatives handed back their gifts: the laptop, the headphones, the leather jacket, all taken away under the guise of precaution, as if I had already been found guilty, as if the mere possibility of my wrongdoing was enough justification to strip me of anything that had been given to me. By the time we left, I felt like I had been hollowed out, like something essential had been taken from me. Not just my gifts, but the trust and respect I had once thought were unshakable. The drive home was silent. My mother staring out the window, my father gripping the steering wheel too tightly, the weight of their disappointment pressing down on me, heavier than anything Aunt Valerie could have done that night. As I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling, I made two promises to myself. I would never again allow anyone to have the power to take something from me, and I would build a life so secure, so untouchable, that I would never need anything from any of them, ever again. The days after the party felt like I had been exiled from my own family, like I had been erased from the narrative of my own life, with each passing moment solidifying the realization that no one was in any hurry to make things right. My parents never brought up what had happened, never sat me down to apologize for their lack of trust, never acknowledged how deeply they had failed me when I needed them the most. Instead, they let the silence stretch between us like an unspoken agreement, as if pretending it hadn't happened would somehow erase the damage that had already been done, making it easier for them to live with the choices they had made that night when my mother finally addressed it weeks later. She didn't offer an apology or even a concession that maybe they had been too quick to believe. Aunt Valerie's lies, only a tired sigh and a quiet suggestion that it would be best if I just moved on, as if she genuinely thought I had the luxury of forgetting something that had completely changed the way I saw my own family. The first time I truly understood just how deep the damage went was on Thanksgiving, when my mother came to my room early in the morning, hesitating in the doorway like she was trying to figure out the right words to soften whatever excuse she was about to give me. She stood there for a long moment, her fingers gripping the edge of the door frame like she was bracing herself before finally saying that Aunt Valerie thought it might be better if I sat this one out just until things settled down, as if I was the problem, as if my presence at dinner would somehow make things worse, instead of the fact that she had allowed a blatant lie to go unchallenged. I remember nodding slowly, pretending I didn't care, pretending it didn't matter that my own family was so eager to push me aside to keep the peace, while my hands curled into fists so tight that my knuckles turned white, holding on to the only thing I could control in that moment: my silence. It started with that one holiday, one small exclusion dressed up as a temporary compromise. But it didn't stop there, because once people decide they're more comfortable without you, it becomes easier and easier to justify leaving you out entirely. Christmas came with another excuse, something about how it would just be too tense for everyone involved, like my presence alone would somehow be disruptive, enough to ruin the entire evening. Easter was already too crowded. My mother explained, her voice careful, like she didn't want to say anything that might make me upset, as if her reasoning was sound enough that I wouldn't see it for what it was: another way to keep me at a distance without having to admit that they were choosing her over me. After a while, they didn't even bother pretending it was temporary, didn't bother acting like I was welcome at all, just let the unspoken rules settle into place as if it had always been that way. As if I had never really belonged there to begin with. The only real connection I had left to family gatherings was Melissa, my cousin who never stopped believing me, never once wavered in, and her loyalty, even when it would have been easier for her to stay quiet and let things be. She sent me photos of Christmas decorations, videos of cousins laughing together, snapshots of gifts being exchanged, always making sure I knew she still considered me family, even when the rest of them were perfectly fine, pretending I didn't exist. She never tried to convince me to come back, never suggested I should just let it go, only sent messages that made it clear she saw the injustice of it all, saw how wrong. Saw how ridiculous it was that no one had even tried to make things right. Once in the middle of an unrelated conversation, she casually mentioned that Aunt Valerie had been telling everyone I was too busy with school to care about family, spending a brand new narrative to make herself look like the bigger person, like she had given me space out of respect rather than pushing me out of the picture entirely. Another time when my mother had briefly floated the idea of inviting me to Elle's graduation party, Valerie had thrown an absolute fit about boundaries, claiming it wouldn't be fair to the rest of the family to disrupt the peace just for the sake of one person who had already chosen to distance themselves. Instead of trying to force my way back into a family that had already decided I wasn't worth the effort, I threw myself into work, into school, into making sure I never had to rely on any of them. Again, never had to put myself in a position where they could take something away from. For me, I picked up extra shifts at a hardware store, working every holiday, volunteering for every weekend slot, making myself indispensable to my boss, a former Marine named Jack, who didn't tolerate laziness, but also recognized when someone was willing to work harder than everyone else. He saw how often I chose work over everything else, how I never hesitated to stay late or pick up the worst shifts. And instead of questioning it, he pushed me to take on more responsibility, to learn management, to start thinking long-term. Instead of just grinding through each day, he never asked why I was always available, never pried into my personal life, only made sure I knew that if I wanted something better for myself, I had to build it with my own hands, because no one was going to hand it to me by the time I graduated high school. I had enough money saved to avoid taking out loans, enough experience to land a solid internship in Seattle, and enough resentment toward my family to make sure I never let myself get pulled back. And while they were gathering for another holiday I hadn't been invited to, I was accepting a full-ride scholarship to a university 3 states away, securing my place in a future where their approval was completely irrelevant. My parents helped me move into my dorm, both of them hovering uncertainly, caught between pride and my achievement, and the quiet guilt of knowing they had failed me in every way that mattered. My mother, who had spent years pretending everything was fine, finally let something crack. Finally, let herself acknowledge, even if only for a second, that they had done something wrong, offering me a hesitant smile before murmuring that they should have handled things differently. It was the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. But by then it didn't matter, because I had already built my life around the understanding that I was on my own, that I couldn't afford to waste time waiting for them to suddenly decide I was worth defending. College wasn't just a fresh start. It was an escape. A way to completely remove myself from the weight of my family's betrayal, to prove to myself that I didn't need them, that I was better off without them. I threw myself into my computer science classes, picked up freelance work, meticulously tracked every dollar I earned, making sure that I never put myself in a position where I had to ask anyone for anything. My roommate used to joke that I was the only college student who had a financial plan with spreadsheets and quarterly savings goals. But for me, it wasn't just about money. It was about control, about making sure that no one ever had the power to take something from me again while I was securing a future. They would never be able to take credit for the family narrative continued to shift, twisting itself into new shapes that suited their version of events, with Aunt Valerie telling everyone that I was too obsessed with money to care about staying connected, that I had chosen to leave them behind out of arrogance rather than necessity. But none of it mattered because I had already made my decision. I wasn't coming back the moment. Everything shifted the moment I realized just how far I had climbed beyond the reach of my family's twisted narratives. Came during my final year of college, when I received a life-changing job offer that would submit my financial independence in a way none of them could have ever imagined I had. Spent years meticulously planning every step, ensuring that every class I took, every internship I applied for, and every freelance project I completed contributed to a future where I would never have to rely on anyone, where no one would ever be able to take away what I had built. The offer came from one of the biggest tech firms on the West Coast, a 6-figure salary straight out of college, full benefits, stock options, and the kind of career trajectory that most people only dreamed of proving beyond any doubt that my stotterstry of complete self-reliance had paid off in ways that not a single person in my family had ever expected, I accepted without hesitation, knowing that this was the moment I had been working toward for years. The moment where I could finally say without a shred of doubt that I had won that same week. My mother called me with news that should have been satisfying, should have given me some sense of vindication. But instead, only left me feeling detached, as if I were listening to someone else's story unfold, rather than my own Aunt Valerie, the woman who had systematically destroyed my relationship with my family, who had cast me out without a second thought, who had reveled in the power. She held over my exclusion had been cleaning out some old storage boxes when she stumbled across something unexpected, an expensive necklace that had gone missing years ago. The very same necklace she had used as proof that theft was an ongoing issue within the family. The same piece of jewelry she had referenced when she accused me at my birthday party. My mother, her voice, hesitant, almost hopeful, explained that Aunt Valerie had made a public show of regret, claiming she must have misplaced it just like she had with the jewelry from my birthday, suggesting that perhaps it was time to put the past behind us, to let bygones be bygones. I stood in my apartment staring at the skyline, my laptop screen still open to my latest investment portfolio, the numbers staring back at me as a stark reminder of just how little I needed them, just how irrelevant their opinions had become. I could hear the expectation in my mother's voice, the quiet plea for me to say something that would make it easier for her to pretend that everything could go back to normal, but I refused to give her what she wanted. I simply told her I was glad Valerie had found her necklace, then excused myself by claiming I had a study group meeting, cutting the conversation short before she had the chance to try and pull me back in the years that followed my graduation were filled with a steady climb toward success. Each promotion, each investment, each carefully calculated financial move bringing me further away from the family that had discarded me, ensuring that I would never again be in a position where they could have any influence over my life. I moved into a high-rise apartment in San Francisco, started making a name for myself in the industry, watched my savings grow into something untouchable, something undeniable, something that no amount of revisionist history could erase. I began receiving holiday invitations again, carefully worded messages from my mother, always phrased as if they had never actively excluded me, as if it had always been my decision to stay away, as if they had been patiently waiting for me to come back, rather than having spent years pretending I didn't exist. I responded with polite but distant refusals, always citing work obligations, though the truth was that I had no interest in giving them the satisfaction of pretending that time had healed something they had never bothered to mend. Melissa, ever loyal, ever observant, made a point to visit me whenever she was in the city, always keeping me updated on the latest shifts in the family's perception of me, always amused by the way Aunt Valerie still couldn't stand the fact that I had not only survived but thrived. She told me that Valerie tried to act indifferent whenever my name was mentioned, pretending that she barely thought about me, but that the ACT fell apart whenever people asked too many questions, whenever someone brought up how well I was doing, whenever she realized that she no longer controlled the way I was perceived. I listened to these updates with mild amusement, never feeling the anger that had once burned so hot, only a detached curiosity about how long it would take before something finally shattered the illusion she had so carefully constructed. That moment arrived in the most poetic way possible when I received an unexpected call from Melissa late one evening, her voice practically vibrating with the kind of barely contained excitement that only came when something truly catastrophic was unfolding. Aunt Valerie had lost everything, not just a little, not just some minor financial setback, but her entire life savings, her retirement fund, the equity in her house, everything she had spent decades building, all gone in the span of a few months thanks to an investment scam that she had fallen for so completely that by the time she realized what was happening, it was already too late. She had met someone online who had promised her, guaranteed. High returns had shown her, fabricated testimonials had fed her every classic lie in the book, and she had believed it so wholeheartedly that she had emptied every account, drained every resource, thrown everything she had into an opportunity that had never existed in the first place. By the time she tried to back out to reclaim what was left, she was met with silence, her so-called financial advisor vanishing into thin air, leaving her to face the consequences of her own blind. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The family, scrambling to figure out what to do, suddenly faced with the reality that the woman who had always positioned herself as the pillar of stability was now on the verge of financial ruin. The moment Melissa told me that details the moment she mentioned that the entire family was in a panic, that they were all desperately searching for a solution. I knew exactly what was coming. Knew without a doubt that my name would be the first to come up when they started looking for someone to save her. 3 days later, my mother sent me a message. No carefully worded excuses, no passive-aggressive distance, just a direct statement that there was a family meeting at Valerie's house that Saturday, and that it was important that I attend. She didn't bother trying to disguise the urgency, didn't attempt to couch it in pleasantries, didn't waste time pretending that they wanted me there for any reason other than the fact that they needed something from me. I stared at the message for a long moment, then let my gaze drift to the financial statements on my desk. The carefully organized records that chronicled every strategic move I had made since the day they had cast me aside. The undeniable proof that I had succeeded entirely without them. I felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet satisfaction as I typed out a single-word reply confirming that I would be there, knowing that for the first time in years, I would be walking into that house not as the scapegoat they had once abandoned, but as the person they now had no choice but to rely on. Walking into Aunt Valerie's house that Saturday, I could feel the weight of every unspoken conversation, every whispered accusation, every carefully constructed lie that had been used to just toy my exile over the years, pressing against the walls, lingering in the air like the ghost of something rotten that had never truly been dealt with. The last time I had been inside this house, it had been decorated for my 17th birthday, filled with laughter and celebration right up until the moment everything had crumbled beneath the weight of her carefully orchestrated betrayal. Now, years later, the atmosphere was entirely different. The once pristine living room carrying the unmistakable signs of stress papers scattered across the coffee table, unopened bills stacked in uneven piles, the desperation in the air so thick that it was almost suffocating. My parents were already seated when I arrived, my mother perched on the edge of the couch with her hands clasped together tightly, my father sitting stiffly beside her, looking as uncomfortable as I had ever seen him, as though he wanted to be anywhere. But here a few aunts and uncles were present, their expressions carefully neutral, none of them quite sure how to acknowledge me. After so many years of silent exclusion, all of them clearly aware that the dynamic had shifted in a way none of them had ever anticipated. Melissa sat in the far corner, her arms crossed, a barely concealed smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Her amusement at the situation making it clear that she had been waiting for this moment almost as long as I had. Then there was Valerie sitting on the opposite couch, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, her usual air of self-importance and control stripped away, leaving behind only the hollow remains of a woman who had built her entire identity on the illusion of being untouchable. Her hands fidgeted with a tissue. In her lap, her makeup doing a poor job of concealing the dark circles under her eyes, her gaze flickering up to meet mine for the briefest of moments before darting away, unable to maintain eye contact for more than a second. "Luca," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, carefully measured, like she was testing the waters to see if I was still as easy to manipulate as I had been when I was 17. "I wasn't sure if you would come." I set my leather portfolio on the coffee table, taking my time as I unbuttoned my coat, making a show of settling into my seat with an ease that I knew would unnerve her, making it clear that I was not the same person she had once steamrolled without consequence when family needs help you show up, I said smoothly, mirroring the exact words she had once used against me, letting them hang in the air long enough for the meaning to settle into her bones. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of years of unspoken resentment thick between us, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing anything but indifference on my face. She launched into her story almost immediately, her voice bed with the kind of forced vulnerability that was meant to elicit sympathy, detailing how she had been tricked by a so-called financial advisor who had presented himself as a successful investor, promising guaranteed returns, backing his claims with fabricated client testimonials and fake documentation. She explained how, She had started with a small investment, seen minor early returns, then convinced of its legitimacy had gone all in, draining her savings, leveraging her house, pouring everything she had into what she believed was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. By the time she realized it was all a lie, by the time she tried to pull her money out, the accounts had been emptied, the advisor had vanished, and she was left with nothing but mounting debts and the looming threat of foreclosure. The room was silent when she finished speaking. Everyone waiting for my response, all of them knowing exactly why I had been invited here, none of them willing to be the one to say it out loud. Valerie cleared her throat, her fingers tightening around, the tissue in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper as she finally voiced what they had all been dancing around. "I know things haven't been perfect between us," she said, choosing her words carefully, as if pretending our history was anything less than catastrophic would somehow change the reality of what had happened. But I was hoping before she could finish, I reached into my portfolio, pulling out a neatly stacked set of documents, laying them out on the coffee table one by one, making sure everyone had a clear view of what I was presenting. The first was a bank statement from my primary savings account. The second, a summary of my investment portfolio. The third, a list of my property holdings. Each document carefully selected to drive home the point that I had built something untouchable, something beyond their reach. Something they had no claim to. The room was so quiet. I could hear the sound of my mother's breathing, could see the way Valerie's eyes widened ever so slightly as she took in the numbers in front of her, the stark reality of my financial success laid out in black and white. "That's impressive," she managed, her voice wavering, her carefully crafted composure beginning to crack beneath the weight of what she was seeing. "It is," I agreed, smoothly, my expression unreadable, refusing to give her the slightest indication of what I was thinking. "You know what else is impressive? How I managed to build all of this, despite being labeled a thief at 17, despite being excluded from every family gathering, despite having every single one of my birthday gifts taken away because of a lie." My mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, my father exhaling heavily, but I ignored them both, keeping my focus on Valerie, watching as the color drained from her face as she finally realized that this conversation was not going to unfold the way she had expected. "I'm not finished," I said, cutting her off before she could attempt some half-hearted apology, pulling out one final document, setting it on top of the others. "This arrived yesterday," I continued, tapping the page with deliberate precision. "It's a promotion, executive position, West Coast Division. I start next month." Valerie's hands trembled slightly, her fingers tightening around the tissue so hard that it crumpled in her grip, her voice barely above a whisper, as she finally voiced what had been weighing on her since the moment I walked through the door. "Surely you wouldn't just watch your family struggle," she said, her words a barely concealed plea, her desperation seeping through the cracks in her carefully maintained facade. I leaned forward slightly, my expression unwavering, my voice steady, as I delivered the words that I had waited years to say. "Funny how that works, isn't it?" The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of my words settling over the room like a final, undeniable truth. A truth that none of them could ignore. A truth that Valerie, for the first time in her life, had no power to manipulate. The silence that followed. My words stretched so long that for a moment I wondered if anyone in the room would even try to argue, if they would scramble for some last-ditch excuse, some final attempt to make me feel guilty, enough to give them what they wanted. My mother, who had spent years convincing herself that ignoring the past was the same thing as fixing it, cleared her throat, softly shifting in her seat, as if she was about to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. Didn't allow anyone to steer this conversation away from the reality that they had all allowed to unfold. I reached for my checkbook, flipping it open with a slow, deliberate movement, letting the weight of the moment settle into the air before speaking again, ensuring that there was no room for misunderstanding, no opportunity for them to twist this into something it wasn't. "I'm going to write you a check." "Valerie," I said, watching as her entire body tensed as a flicker of relief crossed her face, hope creeping into her expression for the first time since I had arrived. "Not because you deserve it, not because I owe you anything, not because I feel even the slightest bit of obligation toward you, but because I refuse to become the kind of person who turns their back when they have the power to help." I let my gaze sweep across the room, making sure each and every one of them understood exactly what I was about to say, that there would be no illusions about where I stood when this conversation was over. But this comes with conditions, and if you can't meet them, then you can consider this the last time you'll ever hear from me." Valerie swallowed hard, her fingers curling into the fabric of her skirt, but she didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't push back because she knew she wasn't in a position to negotiate, knew that, for the first time in her life, she had no leverage, no control, no power over the situation. First, I continued tapping the pen against the edge of the checkbook, keeping my tone as even as possible, making it clear that this wasn't a request, but a demand. "You will write a full detailed admission of what you did when I was 17, including the false accusations, the stolen gifts, the way you manipulated this entire family into believing a lie. You will send a copy to every single person who was in this house that night, ensuring that the truth is not just something whispered about behind closed doors, but something undeniable, something permanent." I watched as the blood drained from her face, as the reality of what I was asking truly set in, as she realized that I wasn't just demanding a confession, but an undoing of the very thing that had defined the last several years of my life. "You can't seriously expect me to." She started, her voice cracking slightly, but I cut her off before she could finish, before she could try to convince me that this was too much, that this was unfair, that she shouldn't have to do something so humiliating just to secure her own survival. "I can, and I do," I said, my tone unwavering, my patience non-existent, refusing to let her turn this into another performance, another drama, plea for sympathy that would somehow cast her as the victim instead of the person responsible for all of this. "And if you want this check, you will do it without argument, without delay, without trying to twist it into something that paints you as anything other than the liar you are." Valerie's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands tightening into fists in her lap. But she nodded once, a stiff, jerking movement that made it clear she understood there was no room for negotiation, that she could either accept the terms or accept the consequences. Second, I continued glancing briefly at my parents, who were both watching me with unreadable expressions. My mother's hands clasped tightly together in her lap. My father's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. "You will attend financial counseling, and I don't mean a few half-hearted sessions to make it seem like you're trying. I mean a full structured program that ensures you never put yourself in a situation like this again." I could feel the tension in the room shift, the weight of my words settling over everyone present, because for the first time someone was forcing Valerie to take responsibility for her own mistakes, to acknowledge that this wasn't just bad luck, wasn't just an unfortunate accident, but the direct result of her own reckless decisions. And third, I said, my voice dropping slightly, making sure they all knew that this was the most important condition of all, the one that would determine whether I ever had another conversation with any of them. After today, everyone in this room needs to understand that this is it, that I am not your backup plan, that I am not your safety net, that I am not the person you come to when things go wrong because you don't know how to fix them yourselves. I let my gaze settle on my mother, watching as her face crumpled slightly as she blinked hard, like she was trying to hold back tears, like she was realizing for the first time just how far out of reach I had become. This is the last time I step in, the last time I offer help, the last time I let any of you pull me back into a family that never once stood by me when I needed it. Valerie let out a slow, shaky breath, nodding again, her movements stilted, her entire demeanor that of a woman who had just been backed into a corner so completely that there was no possible way out. Except through the terms I had laid before her, I finally wrote the check, tearing it from the book and holding it just out of her reach for a long, agonizing moment before finally handing it over, watching as her fingers closed around the paper with a desperation so obvious that it would have been pathetic if I hadn't been so thoroughly detached from caring. But I wasn't done yet. I reached into my portfolio one last time, pulling out a separate document. A printed receipt for a donation made in my parents' names, sliding it across the table with a level of finality that left no room for argument. "This is a donation to a youth education charity," I explained, watching as my father's brows furrowed in confusion as my mother hesitated before reaching for the paper. The exact amount of the gifts that were taken from me when I was 17, adjusted for inflation. I let the weight of that sink in, let them truly process what it meant. Let them Understand that I had never once forgotten, never once let go of what had been stolen from me, never once allowed them to rewrite history into something that absolved them of their part in it. Then, without waiting for a response, without giving any of them the chance to pretend that this changed something between us, I stood up, adjusting my coat, feeling lighter than I had in years as I turned toward the door. Melissa was already on her feet, falling into step beside me, her voice low and filled with barely concealed admiration as she whispered, "That was incredible," making it clear that she had been waiting for someone to put Valerie in her place. For a long, long time, I paused at the doorway, turning back just long enough to deliver one final blow. One last truth that I knew would haunt Valerie for the rest of her life. "You know," I said, my voice calm, detached, utterly unaffected by the wreckage I was leaving behind. "If you had just been kind, if you had just been family, I would have helped you without a single condition." And with that, I walked out, never looking back, knowing that for the first time in years I had finally won.